The powerful roar of the four Pratt & Whitney engines of El Al Flight 1862 echoed across Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport as the Boeing 747-200 cargo jet barreled down the runway. The massive aircraft, loaded with cargo bound for Tel Aviv, lifted off the tarmac, climbing steadily into the sky. The city of Amsterdam stretched beneath it, a tapestry of canals and streets glowing under the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Captain Yitzhak Fuchs, an experienced pilot with decades of flight time under his belt, kept his hands firm on the control yoke. First Officer Arnon Ohad, seated to his right, monitored the instruments closely. Flight Engineer Gedalia Sofer checked the engine readouts, ensuring all systems were performing as expected. Everything seemed routine. At 6,500 feet, the pilots began their turn over the Bijlmermeer district, a densely populated residential area. The aircraft continued its climb, smooth and steady. But then, without warning, an ear-splitting bang shattered the calm inside the cockpit. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. Alarms screamed through the cockpit. The pilots were jolted against their seats as the control yoke fought against them. "What the hell was that?" Ohad shouted, his hands gripping the controls. Fuchs struggled to stabilize the aircraft, his eyes darting to the instrument panel. The displays flickered wildly. Engine warnings, fuel pressure drops, electrical faults. "We've lost power on the right side," Sofer yelled. "Engine failure, no wait, engine's gone." The word sent a chill through the cockpit. Two engines, both numbers 3 and 4 mounted on the right wing, had completely torn away from the aircraft. "Mayday, mayday, mayday! El Al 1862, emergency!" Fuchs shouted into the radio, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Schiphol. Air traffic control responded immediately. "El Al 1862, state your emergency. We've lost 2 engines. Right wing. Repeat, 2 engines gone. Request immediate return to Schiphol." The controllers went silent for a second, likely processing the impossible. Losing 1 engine was rare but manageable. Losing 2 on the same wing, that was catastrophic. The aircraft, now unbalanced, rolled sharply to the right. The remaining left-wing engines struggled to compensate, but the damage was more than just missing engines. When they separated, they had ripped through the wing structure, severing hydraulic lines, cutting critical control surfaces, and puncturing the fuselage. The right wing was crippled. "Full left rudder, trim it out," Fuchs ordered, his hands gripping the shaking yoke. Ohad fought against the uncontrollable roll, forcing the aircraft level, but barely. The 747 trembled violently, its airframe groaning under the immense stress. "Speed's dropping," Sofer warned. "We don't have enough power to maintain altitude." Fuchs clenched his jaw. Returning to Schiphol was becoming less and less of a possibility. The aircraft was losing, lift struggling to stay in the air. He turned back toward the airport, but the plane was sluggish, barely responding. In the neighborhoods below, thousands of people looked up as a wounded giant limped through the sky, trailing smoke and debris. Some had seen the engines detach, mid-air, plunging like meteors toward the ground. Others simply watched in horror as the struggling 747 tilted at an unnatural angle. Inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. "We're not going to make it back," Ohad said grimly, his voice tight. Too much drag, too much damage. Fuchs knew it too. The aircraft was descending whether they wanted it to or not. "Flaps to 10. We need every bit of lift," he commanded. The control panel flickered again. Then another warning sounded. "Hydraulic failure." Sofer's face paled. "We've lost our hydraulics. We've got no control over the flight surfaces." Fuchs didn't hesitate. "Prepare for emergency landing, wherever we can put this thing down." But as he scanned the horizon, he saw nothing but residential. Buildings, apartment complexes stretching for miles. There was nowhere to go. The aircraft shuddered again, rolling dangerously as it continued its uncontrolled descent. They were at 2,500 feet and dropping fast. Fuchs pushed the nose up slightly, desperate to extend their glide. But then came the final blow. A loud metallic snap reverberated through the cockpit. The damaged right wing, already weakened, had lost more structural integrity. The aircraft pitched violently to the right. "Oh God, we're going in," Ohad shouted. Fuchs had no time left. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" The Boeing 747-200 freighter, El Al Flight 1862, soared above the outskirts of Amsterdam, its powerful engines humming steadily. The aircraft, having departed from Schiphol Airport, had been in the air for barely a few minutes. Captain Yitzhak, Fuchs, First Officer Arnon Ohad, and Flight Engineer Gedalia Sofer were performing routine climb procedures, unaware that an invisible catastrophe was about to unfold. The sky was clear, the visibility perfect. Below, the sprawling urban landscape of Amsterdam stretched toward the horizon, a city unaware of the disaster heading its way. In the cockpit, everything seemed normal. The aircraft was climbing past 6,500 feet, banking slightly as it followed its departure path. Then it happened. A sudden, deafening explosion. The entire aircraft lurched violently to the right. The cockpit shook as if they had been struck by an invisible force. An ear-splitting bang echoed through the fuselage, followed by a deep mechanical grinding noise. Fuchs's instincts kicked in instantly. He gripped the control yoke, trying to stabilize the aircraft. What the hell was that? Alarms blared. Warning lights flickered across the control panel. Ohad's eyes darted to the instruments, but the readouts made no sense. The aircraft was losing stability, banking harder to the right, but there was no immediate reason, until Sofer's voice cut through the chaos. "We've lost an engine. No, 2 engines, right wing." A chill ran down Fuchs's spine. He turned to look out his window, only to see what no pilot ever wants to witness. Both the number 3 and 4 engines were missing. They weren't just malfunctioning. They were gone. Torn clean off the wing, their absence left a horrifying, gaping wound in the aircraft's structure. Smoke and debris trailed behind them, and the right wing's exposed frame shuddered under the force of the wind. Pieces of metal had been sheared away, some of them embedding into the fuselage. "Oh my God," Ohad whispered. Inside the cockpit, the aircraft was now in a slow but deadly roll to the right. The remaining 2 engines on the left wing were still operational, but they were now pulling the aircraft unevenly, worsening the imbalance. Fuchs fought the controls. The yoke felt stiff, resisting his commands. The hydraulics were failing, likely damaged when the engines separated. He slammed the radio switch. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, El Al 1862, we've lost 2 engines. Request immediate return to Schiphol." The reply from air traffic control came quickly. "El Al 1862, understood." "Can you maintain altitude?" Fuchs gritted his teeth. "Negative. We're losing control. Aircraft is rolling, hydraulics compromised." In the cargo hold below, unsecured items shifted violently, thrown against the fuselage. The aircraft was struggling to stay airborne, but the right wing damage was far worse than they realized. The engines hadn't just detached, they had ripped through critical systems on their way down. A sudden jolt rocked the plane again. The right wing dipped even further, almost past 45 degrees. The 747 was dangerously close to entering a fatal spiral. Ohad shouted, "We have to counteract the roll, full left rudder." Fuchs slammed his foot onto the rudder pedal, trying to correct the tilt. It worked briefly. The aircraft wobbled, momentarily stabilizing, but it was a losing battle. Sofer, his voice tight, scanned the damage reports. "Captain, it's not just the engines. The right wing's inner structure is compromised. Fuel's leaking, we've lost part of the leading edge." That was the final confirmation. They weren't just dealing with an engine failure. The right wing itself was breaking apart. Fuchs knew it in that moment. They wouldn't make it back to Schiphol. "We need an emergency landing, now." His mind raced for options. There were no runways nearby. Schiphol was still miles away. Below them, only residential neighborhoods stretched in every direction. The aircraft shuddered again, dipping lower. Altitude, 5,000 feet. The 747 was barely holding together. Then, without warning, a second explosion, a sickening metallic snap, reverberated through the aircraft. The right wing cracked further, and suddenly the roll accelerated. The aircraft banked hard right, the nose dipping toward the ground. The cockpit alarm screamed, "Bank angle, terrain, terrain, pull up!" Ohad's voice was desperate. "We're going down!" Fuchs pulled back with everything he had. "Brace for impact." But there was no time left. Below, in the Bijlmermeer district, residents looked up, just in time to see the crippled Boeing 747 plunging toward them. The quiet Sunday evening in Amsterdam's Bijlmermeer district was peaceful. Families gathered in their apartments, preparing for dinner. Children played in the courtyards between the towering apartment blocks. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting an orange glow over the city. But then the peace was shattered. A deafening alien roar echoed through the sky, growing louder by the second. Windows rattled, conversations halted, and thousands of eyes turned upward. Above them, a crippled giant was falling from the sky. The massive Boeing 747-200 freighter, El Al Flight 1862, was no longer flying. It was barely staying in the air. The aircraft was at an unnatural angle, its nose slightly pitched down, the right wing horribly damaged. Smoke and debris trailed behind it. The missing two right-side engines had left a gaping wound in the wing, and the once majestic jet now lurched unevenly, a wounded beast in its final struggle. Inside the cockpit, the battle for survival was all but lost. 1,000 feet. First, Officer Arnon Ohad shouted. His voice was laced with urgency, but deep inside, he knew there was no more altitude left to lose. Captain Yitzhak Fuchs pulled back on the controls, but the yoke barely responded. The right-wing drag was too much. The aircraft was rolling beyond control. Flight engineer Gedalia Sofer's face was pale. "We have no more hydraulics. It's—" A sudden snap reverberated through the cockpit. The aircraft rolled violently. To the right, the nose dipping lower. Ohad gritted his teeth, gripping the yoke. "We can't hold this. 2,000 feet. The ground was rushing toward them. Fuchs clenched his jaw. He knew they had seconds left. They had to put it down somewhere. His eyes darted over the cityscape below. Apartment buildings, roads, parks. No open space, no runway. They were out of time. Then, another jolt. Something within the damaged right wing gave way completely. The aircraft rolled past 90 degrees, nearly inverted. Ohad shouted, "We're going in!" In the final seconds, the last thing the world saw of El Al 1862 was a Boeing 747, twisting unnaturally as it descended directly toward the Groneveen and Klein-Kreutberg apartment complexes. The people on the ground could do nothing but watch, as a fiery shadow engulfed the sky. Impact. A cataclysmic explosion erupted as the massive aircraft slammed into the buildings, its full fuel load igniting on impact. The fireball tore through the structures, instantly obliterating several floors. The shockwave rippled through the district, shattering windows in nearby buildings, sending debris flying in all directions. A thunderous roar echoed for miles before giving way to an eerie silence, one filled only by the crackling flames that consumed what remained. In an instant, El Al 1862 was gone.